my interest is more broadly in the interference between life and environment. And here, as we're in the series of applied nature conservation, I would like to discuss with you the evidence and theoretical argumentation that could justify nature conservation as the basis for climate stabilization. And my work is devoted to the biotic regulation concept. And this is a theoretical framework describing the interaction between life and environment. And it consists in the following statements: that natural ecosystems carry information about the environment that is optimal for themselves, and they stabilize this environment. So they do work on stabilization of optimal conditions. And without their environmental impact, the environment and climate on Earth rapidly deteriorate. So degradation of natural ecosystems by itself, without any human disturbances, can lead to climate destabilization, even if we don't add additional disturbance factors like pollution, like CO2 emissions, and other than that. So, but when we look at life on Earth, how can we, what kind of evidence can we, what kind of evidence do we have to decide whether life regulates the environment? That is, it provides a stabilizing impact when something goes wrong, or alternatively, it follows the changes, trying to adapt to external perturbations. And the my expertise has been that it is best to discuss problems and to approach problems that are perceived as challenges in the scientific community. And when you look at these problems, you get the needed insights, because it is there that science opens and you can get important insights. And so we will discuss two problems. One is the missing thing. It is devoted to carbon cycle, and another is hot models, and it is about global climate models. So what do we know first about the missing thing? What do we know about life and its environment if we look at our unique planet? First, what we do know is that the stocks, we know approximately the stocks of major nutrients like carbon, which is the main nutrient used by life. And it is about 1,000 gigatons, both in organic and inorganic form in the biosphere. Meanwhile, the turnover time, the net primary productivity of the biosphere as a whole is about 100 gigatons of carbon per year. So from this, we get this basic time scale for environmental change, which is about 10 years, a few years. So in just a few years, the biosphere could significantly change environmental conditions. So, and it was one of the first scientists who noticed this was Professor Vladimir Vernadsky, who also coined the term noosphere. So basically, what we have, this turnover time of a few years for environmental change is much smaller and shorter. It is a much shorter time scale than the characteristic time of evolutionary processes, of adaptation, of genetic evolutionary change. And this is a strong indication that life on Earth regulates the environment rather than adapts to it. So this is the fact that the evolutionary time scale is about 1 million year and more for species duration, and that it is much longer time scale than the characteristic environmental change on the biotic impact, is one of the important indications that life regulates rather than adapts. And so the principle of biotic regulation of the environment is that when there is a perturbation, the normally closed cycle of the nutrients becomes open, and there appears a compensating flux that returns the environment to its original state. For example, here we can see these black arrows indicate production and decomposition, for example, of organic matter. And when there is a perturbation, for example, addition of CO2, how to return the environment to the original state. Either production of organic matter can increase, or decomposition can decrease, or both. So there is a compensatory openness of nutrient cycles that will result in a compensatory environmental impact. And so we can now apply these expectations to the our global situation, when we basically have a global experiment. For example, if we were aliens, like looking at the Earth from the space and deciding how can we test whether life on this planet can regulate its own environment or it can't, what can we do? And they would decide, let us disturb the main parameter, one of the main parameters that dictates life functioning, this CO2 concentration, which governs plant functioning and many other things, and see what happens. So these aliens could decide something like that. And this global experiment is what is now going on. But how the conventional view would view what would happen? The traditional view, conventional view, highlights the closed biogeochemical cycles, that if left by itself, the biota operates on global, on closed cycles, and this is what we also want to achieve in our economy, for example. And that is why when the studies of global carbon cycle were only gaining momentum, there were many publications and many scientists thought that the biota won't be participating. And this could be even a prominent ecologist, Professor Odum, wrote that this closeness of the cycles is what represents the state of maximum control of the environment. And he meant that if the ecosystem cycles everything, then it is independent of the environment. But in reality, why it can be called a paradox? Because when cycles are closed, there is zero environmental impact and no regulation of the environment. So if the ecosystem works on the basis of closed cycles, it cannot react to changes in its environment and cannot keep the environment in its optimal state. And so if we look at the results of this global carbon experiment, and this is the global carbon cycle as it is now quantified, we can see that indeed there is a biotic impact, and the biota does indeed accumulate a certain amount of carbon, removing it from the atmosphere. Pardon. So here we can see that there is emission of due to fossil fuel burning, like about around 10 gigatons per year. There is addition from land use. This is what accumulates. This is what accumulates 5.2 in the atmosphere, gigatons per year. This is what is accumulated in the physico-chemical system of the ocean. And these three, and this is a small thing, these three terms were known from the very beginning. So they were relatively well quantified. And then there was a missing thing about, if we take the biota as a whole, about 2 gigaton per year. So scientists saw that a certain amount of carbon, basically like almost 1/3 of the emissions, goes somewhere and they didn't know where. And they couldn't accept, and they couldn't for a very long time, they couldn't assign it to the biota because of those ideas that I just discussed with you. So it was the missing thing. And only after, so there was like the law of nature of matter conservation stated that this carbon must go somewhere, and they were forced to admit that it goes to the land biota. So we have two, in a way, alternative views on how life interacts with the environment. The basic principle of natural biota functioning can be either closed by a chemical cycle, or cycles that open when it is needed to stabilize the environment. Environmental impact of the biota is either zero, or in the biotic regulation concept, it has maximum stabilizing impact. And if the biota is disturbed, its impact is destabilizing. And this this shows that if we want maximum stability of climate, we need to have maximum possible areas with undisturbed biota. And so but what I want to say is that this missing thing could not have been predicted from what still remains our like mainstream understanding of how ecosystems are organized, that they are limited by nutrients and can only react to limiting nutrients being elevated in the environment. So, so even though the evidence disproved the concepts, the ruling concept the concept wasn't changed, and there wasn't any, I would say, debriefing of the situation. And now, more recently, already in 2020 and later, scientists begin to admit that CO2 fertilization that was called up as an explanation for this missing carbon sink doesn't actually explain this. So we don't know how this sink is, how is it is pronounced. And this, here you can see another representation of the carbon cycle, and where the partitioning is made differently. And we can see that fossil fuel emissions and accumulation and ocean sink inorganic, but this is all that is emitted from fires, deforestation, and forest degradation. And this is due to explosive development of satellite data. Now we can quantify the increment of live biomass, of how many trees there are on Earth. And we can see that actually the biomass increment, which would be predicted by CO2 fertilization, is really very, very minor. So in this particular study, they estimated it at 0.2 gigatons per gigatons of carbon per year. So almost 10 times less than the missing carbon sink. And this means that this sink is a community response. And this is very important, which means an ecological community response, which means that it is not plants that synthesize more, but it is the soil microbiome that regulates the decomposition rates in such a manner that more long-lived organic matter is produced, and it doesn't return back to the atmosphere. So it is a very complex response of the ecological community as a whole. And it is not, we don't know which particular community actually performs this response, where this ecosystem is located. And the important thing now to look at is the oceanic biota. Now that we talk more and more about how important it is to preserve the biochemical, geochemical cycles in the ocean, we can recall that oceanic biota, which contributes about 1/2, slightly less than 1/2 to global net primary productivity, it was excluded very early from the consideration of the global carbon cycle on the basis that its response couldn't be explained by CO2 fertilization. Just because people thought that it is limited by other nutrients, by phosphorus, nitrogen. You can see on the left here a citation from very prominent researchers in the global carbon cycle, Siegenthaler and Salmian. So, but if now we can see that CO2 fertilization on land cannot explain this thing, maybe it can be in the ocean. And it is the oceanic biota that synthesizes long-term, long-lived organic carbon compounds that escape from the global carbon cycle and are deposited, for example, on the oceanic depth. And this would be the response predicted from the biotic regulation concept in 1986. And indeed, new data that are being accumulated seem to be consistent with the fact that there can be a substantial oceanic carbon sink, biotic carbon sink. Because just one more thing, what's the problem? If productivity is not limited by carbon, but for example, the less abundant is phosphorus or nitrogen or iron, then how is it possible to still to ensure a sink of organic carbon? By changing this stoichiometric ratio of the organic matter that is produced. And now researchers are finding changed ratio of carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus. And when there are more and more carbon in these newly synthesized products, and they are escaping remineralization and can be stored in the sea and in the ocean, and ensuring that missing carbon sink. So this is why I was talking about this in some details, because it is a very important two things, that our mechanistic view on how ecosystem functions was unable to predict this or now explain this sink, which is a significant, even though not so significant as it could be had we more ecosystems in undisturbed state. And from what we now know, this sink is a response of the community as a whole. So there is a correlation in the functioning of primary producers and decomposers. And this is very important because it means that ecosystem has it functions as a regulatory unit as a whole and should be protected as a whole, not as some species and biodiversity counts. So this is was one thing. And another thing, so about hot models. This is a related but distinct topic. So what I wonder whether somebody heard about these hot models, this phrase. It is interesting. Maybe you heard that 2023 was a record year with a record high temperature. And it also the year that broke the model's predictions by a record margin. So mainstream scientists admitted serious knowledge gap. But this is not what hot models refer to. Hot models problem, and it is a recognized problem, it consists in the fact that some of the most sophisticated global climate models of the latest generation began to predict anomalous warming pursuant to doubling, the so-called climate sensitivity, in excess of 5 degrees. So this is, here you can see this record. And this is 2023, and here we can see 2024, and for data for April go like this. So we are still in the record warms. Yes, here it is like more recent. And here there are these models. This is the latest generation 6, and this is previous 5th generation. And these are models from different centers, scientific centers in the world. They are listed on the left. And this is their equilibrium climate sensitivity, which by how much degrees the planet will warm when the ocean equilibrates and CO2 doubles and the ocean equilibrates. So this equilibrium climate sensitivity. And these are contributions from different processes, like this is CO2 forcing, this is albedo, and these are clouds. And you can see that some models predict warming in excess of 5 degrees. And these are very good, very complicated models, which people invested a lot of efforts and money and computer time. And they predict this very high sensitivity. And this means that the projections of warming are even worse than we thought. But the problem is that the models that predict much less warming, they better describe the past. Indeed, when these models improved and began to predict a lot of warming, the past didn't change. And so the models that the past apparently didn't correspond to such a high climate sensitivity. So now there is this conflict that these are very good models, that they describe clouds very well. They describe water vapor amount very well, but they don't have the temperature trend very well. And so this is a problem. And the solution that the scientists came up with, it was just to downscale these hot models in IPCC accounts. So just downscale them, and so just to reject them a posteriori. But actually, this strange divergence of models can have an explanation provided by the biotic regulation concept if we consider that natural ecosystems impose a compensatory impact on the environment, stabilizing impact. So again, we have a familiar narrative that we know that CO2 accumulation warms the planet, and to save the planet, we must decarbonize. And there is also, it is almost complete narrative, but then there is something small that also there is a biodiversity. So in the familiar narrative, like biodiversity is something external or not logically related to the task of restabilizing the climate. If we look at the biotic regulation, we can have a distinct perspective. CO2 accumulation warms the planet, okay. But the more so, the more we exploit or destroy natural ecosystems. And so to save the planet, besides fighting with CO2 emissions, we must protect natural ecosystems, decreasing climate sensitivity to CO2 accumulation. So, sensitivity, climate sensitivity is, as we discussed, by how much temperature changes for a given change in CO2. So we can see here that there is low sensitivity because a lot of CO2 change and a small change of temperature. And this is high sensitivity. Small temperature, small change of CO2 and big temperature change. So again, in the familiar narrative, we have that more CO2, more warming. So if this person is CO2 and this is Earth and this is warming, so CO2 is pushing the Earth towards more warming, and then more CO2, more warming. In the biotic regulation narrative, what changes is that in the presence of natural ecosystems, it is more difficult for CO2 to warm, to go in this horizontal direction. So this is low sensitivity. And high sensitivity is when it is easy for CO2 to push the planet towards higher temperatures. Less natural biota, less natural ecosystems, more warming even with the same CO2. And so the levers with which the natural ecosystems can ensure these different climate sensitivities are Earth albedo and greenhouse effect. And just a moment. So this is how it works. We can think of a potential function describing stability of the Earth's climate, and when we remove natural ecosystems, this stability pit disappears, and if we have additional disturbance like CO2, it can push the planet, say, to catastrophic warming. So, just once again, so here, this curve illustrates the potential function for Earth climate, which changes when we remove or restore natural ecosystems. And the actual levers that ecosystems can use are clouds. And we know that clouds can both warm, like as a rule of thumb, high clouds warm and low clouds cool. And we also know that natural ecosystems and especially forests on land are very effective regulators of clouds. For example, here, this left graph shows the predominant occurrence of clouds over forests. These shallow convective clouds form on warm days in summer, and they significantly cool the land surface. But what is important, this right graph shows the cloud cover and forests and non-forests, and depending on a measure of leaf area index. And we can see that the proportion of the cloud cover grows in forests, these blue symbols, but it declines in non-forests at high leaf area index. It means that when we change primary forests or natural forest ecosystems and replace them with productive but artificial systems that are very productive, have high leaf area index, but they are not natural ecosystems. They do not perform the same environmental regulation as natural ecosystems. So we basically change the program of the when we replace species arbitrarily, we change the program of that governs how the biota interacts with the environment. And so this graph shows that we have these two processes that lead to climate destabilization that we are now having. First, there is growth of CO2 concentration, and second, there is loss of primary ecosystems. So loss of those mechanisms or agents that work to keep the climate stable. And that is why this explains or can explain what we see in climate models. Because if with the loss of primary ecosystems, we lose this climate buffer, then models that better describe this state will have a higher sensitivity, climate sensitivity to CO2 emissions than models that were fitted to this state. So these hot models that appeared all of a sudden in the global climate modeling enterprise, they are actually signaling us about the fact that we are losing our climate stabilizers. So the takeaway messages from what I said: the missing thing, around 1 gigaton of carbon per year, is consistent with ecosystems providing a stabilizing response to the atmospheric CO2 perturbation. So this global carbon experiment is consistent with the idea that the main principle, the governing principle of biosphere organization, is to provide stabilizing impact on the environment and compensate perturbations. This is about missing thing. The high climate sensitivity in the new generation of global climate models can be an indication of increasing climate sensitivity due to the ongoing loss of primary ecosystems. So this is, and we can actually quantify, and this is what we are doing, by how much the sensitivity will increase if we continue to lose these ecosystems that still exist. Because even if their cumulative area that they occupy decreases, but as the response is proportional to perturbation and the perturbation grows, they are working more and more actively. So the price of losing 1 hectare of a primary ecosystem is ever increasing. So combining these ideas with the available evidence, we can calculate how much of increase of future increase of sensitivity we can avoid if we just impose a moratorium on cultivation of all remaining ecosystems now. And in this sense, nature conservation and biodiversity conservation, if understood as preservation of functional climate regulating ecosystems can become a tool for climate stabilization. So let us cooperate globally to urgently stop the destruction of all the remaining wilderness. Thank you.